Thank you for being here. So if you can start off by just introducing yourself briefly and the work that you do.
Sure. So I'm Saritha Irugalbandara. I'm the current head of advocacy at #Generation. So I started off as an analyst, particularly mapping technology facilitated gender-based violence. And it's been 3 years since I've joined hashtag. So a little background on hashtag itself. We're a feminist, anti-racist, youth-led movement who use new media tools to examine the ways in which everybody in Sri Lanka, regardless of their background, their religion, ethnicity, gender, can be a part of the decision-making processes at every level of not just government, but also just decision-making in general. So I'm also a capacity builder. I also do a lot of capacity building, particularly for young people, including queer youth in Sri Lanka on digital rights and security. And I'm also a researcher on TFGBV and SGBV as a whole. So I think that will suffice as my introduction.
Thank you so much. So I think maybe to start off with, if you can tell us a bit about the work you do around addressing technology facilitated gender-based violence in Sri Lanka, but also I think just trying to understand it. What are some of the manifestations that you see? What are the existing patterns? Are there any emerging issues?
Right. So to talk about the work that we do, like I said, I started off as an analyst, so which is one of the key components of the work we do at hashtag. So we run a real-time social media monitoring and analysis effort, spanning across Facebook, TikTok, and YouTube in Sri Lanka, and we do this in all three official languages, so English, but also Sinhala and Tamil. So social media analysis helps us sort of unpack the patterns and the trends that we observe, the manifestations of TFGBV itself. And this, of course, falls into the bucket of research, or what we call our evidence-based approach to advocacy. And our advocacy work therein relates to how we engage with big tech. So we're a trusted partner with the aforementioned tech companies. And we use this evidence-based, the research that we do, the monitoring work we do, to actually advocate for greater accountability, greater transparency, and especially with regards to gender-based violence, to actually adopt a more victim-centric or survivor-centric and culturally relevant approach to content regulation and moderation on their platforms. And our other advocacy also deals with the legislative processes in Sri Lanka and the criminal legal system, particularly on how these two components of state actually deal with TFGBV, or rather fail to deal with TFGBV in a tangible way. And we also do capacity building. Our main focus is young people, so there's a big digital literacy gap in Sri Lanka. So our capacity building aims to bridge that. Particularly, we focus on women and minoritized groups, especially outside of our urban centers, where this digital literacy gap is very pronounced. And as of last year, we also set up Trustcare, which is an ecosystem of support. One of the main components of it is a hotline, a trilingual hotline that provides free of charge legal first aid and legal aid referral, psychosocial first aid and psychosocial referral, and technological support. And the other component of it, of course, and it also happens with our social media monitoring, we are big on documentation, because even when setting up Pratya, we co-created this with Delete Nothing, this trilingual documentation tool, particularly focusing on TFGBV. So documentation is also a key component of our work, because this evidence base, while not providing like the full picture or the full extent of the prevalence of it, still provides, I think, a significant amount of data to substantiate why we have to adopt approaches that are different from the usual criminal legal approaches to addressing TFGBV. In terms of the manifestations in Sri Lanka, I think this is also common across South Asia, particularly. I think image-based sexual exploitation abuse is prevalent. And if I may say so myself, I think it has also reached quite like uncontrollable or unfathomable proportions at the moment, particularly because access to technology has become very easy, but navigation of technology has not become equally easy for everybody. There's a huge gender gap in how people navigate technology in Sri Lanka, which means that perpetrators, who are generally men, are able to navigate this technology far easier than women and children and gender minority groups. So image-based sexual abuse and exploitation is very, very high. And other manifestations we see are also the normalization of misogynistic hate speech on all these platforms. We see campaigns of harassment, campaigns of misogyny, targeted misogyny. And of course, we also, in these campaigns, we also see direct incitements to and sexual violence, particularly sexual violence against especially women and against gender minority groups. We've also recently been seeing, I think, with the sort of rising popularity in generative AI, we have seen this worrying trend in Sri Lanka of the creation of AI-generated nude photographs. We've previously seen, the rudimentary use of Photoshop to, digitally alter images and use it to threaten and extort women. But now we are seeing generative AI, which is a lot more sophisticated and we are seeing this as a looming threat. We've seen a few celebrities being on the receiving end of this harassment. So that, I guess, is a more new manifestation, but something that we see. And of course, I think a lot of this also falls under the umbrella of like gender disinformation. I think you can't talk about TFGB without discussing gender disinformation and the complexity of it, where gender disinformation isn't just false information. It doesn't just have the intention to mislead. There's also an intention to defame, to character assassinate, to portray particularly women and particularly people singled out as being queer or LGBTIQ plus, as being morally other than common society. So we can't talk about TFGB without talking about gender disinformation, but these are the main manifestations we see, and a lot of other things we see, of course, fall under these like big buckets, I would say.
Thank you so much, Saritha. So I think already you've touched on, some of the responses that are available, but can you go a little deeper into that and tell us a little bit about what does the existing ecosystem of responses to technology facilitated gender-based violence look like in Sri Lanka? And also, what are the state responses, but also are there non-state responses? Are there more community-based responses that you see? So just an overview of that.
So in terms of looking at the existing ecosystem, we'll start top to bottom. So state, we have the Computer Crimes Investigation Department, the CCID, which is the premier state institution tasked with handling TFGBV. There's manifest issues there because it's the only agency, even though technically local police stations are empowered to also take on cases of TFGBV, but there's a huge issue of the lack of technical capacity and also lack of willingness to actually take on cases of TFGBV by the police. So that's the sort of state apparatus. And within it, there are also, within the state apparatus, there's also government agencies and regulatory bodies connected to the Ministry of Women's Affairs, for example, and then you have a Women and Children's Bureau that is attached to the police. So all of these agencies are responsible for taking on cases of TFGBV. And as of a few years ago, the National Child Protection Authority is also empowered to take on cases of TFGBV that affect minors. But the problem here, of course, is that these agencies, like cross-agency communication, is almost non-existent. There's a lot of bureaucratic red tape, and there's a lot of conflict, I think, in working together. So that apparatus, that's sort of where I stand. And then, of course, we've got our INGOs, particularly UNFPA, UN Women, and UNDP to a certain degree, who have done programs and continue to do these programs on TFGPV, mainly focusing on awareness building. And also capacitating grassroots organizations on digital rights. I think INGOs also, I think, perform some of the crucial components of funding other CSOs, local CSOs and grassroots organizations in Sri Lanka, who are doing a lot more research than there used to be a few years ago. And there's a lot more renewed, I said not renewed, there's a lot of interest now in researching and doing a lot of work around TFGBV in Sri Lanka. And then after INGOs, I would say CSO, civil society organizations. So like hashtag. Like I said, the interest around TFGBV has been on the upward trend in the last few years. So a lot of CSOs now, even in their programmatic work around FGBV, take on TFGBV within it, in the very least. So even for 16 days, I think even last year, the global theme was on digital rights, right? Like a gendered perspective. So CSOs do a lot of, again, a lot of training, but CSOs also run a lot of hotlines and a lot of documentation processes. We have several hotlines that our CSO run in Sri Lanka. And a lot of CSOs also provide legal support to persons affected by TFGPV. This is because the current apparatus doesn't make it easy for persons affected to actually access legal support, even if it's just legal advice. So there's a few CSOs who actually specialize in this, which I think is a positive development, but my thoughts on the carceral system we can get into later. But that is sort of the apparatus. And then, of course, I think community responses are super important, particularly when you move outside of Colombo, where CSO, like the reach of these organizations and the know-how, and also the language around TFPBV is less known. There's a lot of community responses, particularly, I think, focusing on, even if it's quite rudimentary, still important things like sharing knowledge on how to report something, on how to get something removed. Albeit, we have also seen instances of, community responses like self-censorship being proposed as a solution to actually to mitigate harm caused by a manifestation of TFGBV. So that's where the community responses lie. But I think one of the positive things I have seen, I think, at least in our work in the last year, is trying to draw these bridges between community responses and CSO responses, where we don't tell them how to do what they're doing, but rather provide any support that they need to strengthen what they do within their communities. And that's, I think, quite a positive development for sure.
Thanks. And I think, so the next question, along these lines is, as someone who is actively working on this in Sri Lanka, what are the kind of advocacy asks you see coming from feminist and human rights activists and organizations around the kind of state response that they want for technology facilitated gender-based violence? And, are they down the lines of, criminal justice, or do you see demands for more comprehensive approaches? And then there is the proposed online safety bill in Sri Lanka, right now, which is also being challenged by many in the Supreme Court at the moment. So does the bill reflect those, the demands that are coming, and any kind of, reflections you want to do around that? Because I think for myself also, as someone who has been working on the issue, for a while, there has been some internal conversations that I've had to do with myself to say, okay, what kind of precedents are we setting? What are the, what's happening in terms of what we are asking for? So yeah, I would love to hear some of your thoughts around this.
Sure. So that's actually something that I've also been grappling with, I think, especially the last few months. But I'll answer the first part of your question, which is what are the general asks from CSOs and other practitioners. So I do think a lot of it, unfortunately, is rooted in the belief that the carceral system is what's going to quote unquote fix this issue. So a lot of it is along the lines of improving gender sensitivity of police. Promoting that. So trainings for police is something that a lot of CSOs have been engaged with in the last few years. There's also a lot of ask for, actually this I think is more of a comprehensive thing, like comprehensive sexual education, particularly for children. I think has been a big ask, and increasingly there's also a push to include a digital literacy component along with CSE, so that from a young age, children are empowered with this knowledge on how to navigate the digital space. I do also see some facets of CSO also ask for new laws because there is this belief that we don't have adequate laws to actually address TFGBV. And I can see the argument for that because true to fact, we don't now, for example, on image-based abuse, we don't have a written law, a letter of the law that stipulates it as a crime. Instead, what we do is in the legal system, what happens is you take components of the Penal Code and the Obscene Publications Act and then the Computer Crimes Act, and you formulate the offense as that's how you do it, you interpret it. So there has been calls for new laws, particularly I think around the language of protecting women and children. So I do think this ask to protect women and children is also what drives a lot of the work that has been done, which is why a lot of the work also focuses on training, on talking about what manifestations do you find, and talking about what can the state do to quote unquote protect. But I think there's not been as much of an ask of how do we actually provide people with the agency to decide what protection looks like for themselves. For example, like this protect women and girls thing, when you go into these rooms with CSOs and grassroots organizations, there's also a lot of conflation of image-based abuse with digital sex work. So a lot of them, you'll start talking about child abuse and image-based abuse, and then they're like, yeah, there are women, on these websites selling their body for money. They should also be criminalized. So that is also seen as a way to protect women and girls. But then there's no question of, okay, but from whom? Who are we protecting? So I think a lot of CSOs, like the ask is framed around this idea, which I think is rooted in quite like a bit of carceral thinking, and rooted in these ideas of obscenity, decency, morality, all of these things. So to your question about the OSB, whether it, meets this ask, I think the government has insisted that it does meet this ask of protecting women and children. Now, bear in mind, the OSB doesn't mention women anywhere. It does mention children, but it uses the term child pornography. So there in itself, I think we see a big problem because the term child pornography also assumes consent. That's one. And two, there's not as any serious focus on how exploitation isn't just about like children's nudes being leaked. Exploitation is also, there's a process of grooming that happens. You don't even have to be online as a child to actually be exploited this way. So I think if the question is, does it meet us? I think they say it does, but does it actually meet the needs of who they are, quote unquote, trying to protect? I absolutely disagree. And another thing, I think the OSP, there's a lot of inherent manifest issues with the bill itself, particularly in how it gives the executive direct power over setting up this regulatory body, who will then determine what is a false statement or a prohibited statement. So it's a direct connection between the executive and the freedom of expression, which again, I think, to my earlier point about protection, which again neglects to provide people with any agency, and then assumes that they predetermine what is to be protected and who is to be protected. And if we know anything about laws that are premised on these notions, we know that they don't really do a lot of protecting. Instead, what we have is this this bit of a Frankenstein's monster of a bunch of technical terms glued together with political will to actually suppress freedom of expression. But no, I mean, I think even the CSOs who ask for new laws have skepticism about this bill. But of course, their argument is we need new laws, but we don't need this law, which again, then it's like, okay, then what kind of law do we want? But I think, yeah, I think that the issue is with us consistently talking about protecting women and girls and children. So
Thanks. And I mean, I know I'm not asking the easy or straightforward.
that's okay.
But yeah, so I think then I guess let's go to that point you made around, okay, so if new laws are the answer or not the answer, I guess we don't fully know right now. But I guess one, in your experience, even with the kind of, the mishmash of laws that we are using right now to address the issue, like how far do people get with cases? Like, is it effective? Is it working? And do you have a sense, even if we have a new law, whether they add an article to the penal code or whatever that new law might look like, do we have conducive, a conducive environment for those to be used effectively? Who usually gets criminalized, because we know proximity to power, these are all factors also in, how well or not laws may work. So that's, one. And I think connected to that, when we are asking for TFGBV to be recognized as violence, like you said, then are we enabling the state to clamp down? And how do we, as people who have to also be answerable to people who are experiencing these forms of violence, what is the way that you try to navigate this fault line, in your everyday work? So yeah, I know that's a few things, but I think they're connected.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So I think to your first part about how far do the laws work, I don't think they work. And I know that I sound contradictory right now, but the reason they don't work is because we are not serious about institutional strengthening. The fact that if my pictures get leaked today, I should be able to go to the nearest police station, file a complaint, and have them take action. But what will instead happen is I will go to the police station, I will be re-traumatized because they will ask me a bunch of intrusive questions about why I sent the picture, who did I send it to, all that. only for them to then say, oh, we don't know what to do about it, or we don't know the law, and tell me to go to the CID. And then at the CID, it's such there's no telling whether or not they will take down my complaint. And then there's no telling whether or not they will actually open an investigation. Bear in mind I think as far to your question about how far do laws go, I think for a problem like TFGBV, laws are not going to work because the way criminal law works is it's retroactive. It works retroactively. Something should have happened that is a criminal offense for them to take action, which means at that point the harm has already happened. And then there's the question of, but what do survivors actually do? If someone has their picture leaked 9 out of 10 times, nobody wants to go to the police and hash this out again in front of a bunch of strangers, in front of a very intimidating environment. And Sri Lanka has, I mean, by law, if you are a woman or a child and you have a complaint, you can go to the Women and Children's Desk. But you ask anybody who has experienced this and gone to the police station, it's very rarely just a woman. There's also other men in the room asking you these questions, taking down a complaint. 9 out of 10 times, nobody wants to do that for very obvious reasons. And 9 out of 10 times, I think this idea that all survivors want a carceral solution to it, want quote unquote revenge, is also fundamentally untrue. And we know this through our work, through Pratya, and also through our other engagements. A lot of the time, they just want their picture removed. They just want the person who hurt them to admit that they did it, or they just want their hurt to be acknowledged. A lot of the time, with SGBV in general, but also TFGBV, the inability for survivors to speak openly is the root cause. You can't come out and say that this happened to me. You can't name your perpetrator, because we know there's a lot of victim blaming, there's a lot of questioning, this assumption of guilt on the victim and this assumption of innocence on the perpetrator, because innocent until proven guilty, right? So we're thinking of enacting laws in this environment. What makes you think people actually want to go to trial? We know that criminal legal trials on sexual violence sometimes take like 10 to 15 years for it to actually resolve. So the reason laws don't work is A, because we don't have the institutional capacity. B, even if we did have the institutional capacity, I don't think they're a conducive way to actually tackle TFTP, particularly because if we're talking about a rights-based issue, we need to ground that rights-based issue in other things like education, technical literacy, consent education, like economic capacity, and this gender gap in navigating the internet, access to technology, all of these things. You need to ground it in that if we are thinking of solutions. And a lot of the times, like I said, survivors, they just want to be heard. So if we want to foster an environment where that is possible, I think that therein is the solution, because it has to require a whole of community to come to terms with the fact that this happens, and a whole of community to actually agree and back up a survivor, to support a survivor. But right now, it's the opposite that happens. To like TFGBV as violence, and whether we are kind of arming the state with this ammo, this is actually something that I have grappled with, especially in the last few months with the OSP, because so as practitioners, we've been fighting to say TFGBV is SGBV, and you need to recognize it as a legitimate form of sexual and gender-based violence. And then when the OSP came out, a big argument was, well, now, TFGBV has been on the rise, and now we have this new bill, and that is going to solve the problem. And we've had like the executive and members of the government say, yeah, this is what we are going to do to protect women and girls. So I personally don't have an answer to that question. I do think, however, I don't want to see it as us enabling that conditioning because I think that's unfair. I think it's also facetious to think that the political will behind using this as ammo is not fueled by other ambitions. Like we know that they are not serious about protecting women and girls. So I don't think that's on us. That's not our responsibility. But I do agree, like we are answerable, right, to survivors. If let's say a bill like OSP passes and it still is not working, we are still answerable to people. And I think that's why as CSOs, like I think we need to, as much as possible, move away from this framing of protect women and girls, but go more towards how do you actually give women and girls the agency? How do you actually empower them and empower the communities they live in, their immediate communities, to actually support each other if something happens? And I think I think it's important to frame PFGBV as violence. We know that it's I perhaps like the some of the most insidious forms of violence actually happen online now, and because technology is so accessible. But to understand that tech is just the modality for this violence to happen, and not just the reason that this violence happens, I think is important. And as for enabling the state, I think for us to create some distance, I would start by disagreeing with this notion of protecting women and girls, because that is a slippery slope. Protection assumes you are taking action on someone's behalf, not, and it should be you have to let people decide what they want to do. And that doesn't come from the protectionist mindset. That has to come from this mindset of everybody deserves the opportunity, the knowledge, the capacity to actually decide for themselves. Um, so I do think we have to keep trying to frame TFGPV as violence, but you have to then disagree with the state that, hey, the answer to violence isn't just making laws. The answer to violence lies in looking at the root causes of it, looking at the underlying causes of it. What other intersecting rights actually give cause to, this type of violence to happen.
Thanks, Saritha. And I think the last couple of questions, but let's say you have unlimited resources and political will, right? Like, let's just, because now this is very depressive, like, the moment we are in. So I'm going to now try to take us to a place where we have unlimited resources and a lot of political will, right? So what would an ideal ecosystem of responses to technology facilitated gender-based violence look like to you? It doesn't have to be an exhaustive list of things, but like, at least what are the values that you would say? Because I think you've said a lot about we need to challenge protectionism. So then if not protectionism, what are the values, or like the ideals we want to have in how we want to be online? Like so let's talk a little bit about what the ideal scenario could look like from where you are standing here.
Honestly, if I didn't give a short answer, like if I could make everybody just listen to me and just do what I say.
And then you wonder how like dictators are made.
Right, exactly. But like I can't be the only one who hasn't had this thought, right? Like, cause sometimes it really feels like you're screaming into the void. So you're just like, I wish, if I was president, I would make people listen, but it would be for the greater good. But, jokes aside, if I had infinite resources, man, I don't even know. But in terms of values, I would say, like if I met, like obviously within this existing system, right? I would ideally want like people in power to actually kind of, even if they can't do a lot, even just saying it matters. particularly because with like celebrity culture in Sri Lanka, for example, and the fact that no matter how much we dislike politicians and people in power, people still do listen to them. So in Sri Lanka, we have a system where like parliamentarians will literally hurl like these misogynistic slurs, at other parliamentarians, which is ridiculous. So you see this like this disgusting normalization of of misogyny, of like gendered hate speech. We've had a sitting president use a homophobic slur against his own prime minister, right? So what we really need is, I think, like people in power to have the political will to actually even just say, hey, this is not okay. I think that goes a long way. Like I think people assume that just because, I don't have a lot of power to change anything, I don't think that's true. I think whatever you say, there might be at least one person listening. So I think that matters. I think as far as values go, primarily I would want sort of survivors to be heard, just to be heard. And there shouldn't be any fear of repercussion when they are actually speaking their truth. A lot of people don't name their perpetrator, don't name their abuser because of the repercussions, because the repercussions are so much greater when you put a name to the face. That shouldn't be the case. So I think that inherently should be a value. Then the other value I would want to see is this focus, like moving away um, from questioning how it happened, why it happened, all of that, but really just asking people, okay, what do you want to do about it? How can I meet you halfway? How can we meet you? So ideally, the systems we create, or the systems we are going to create with like infinite resources, has to have that baseline. Um, Survivor centrism, I think a lot of the time is misinterpreted as like, oh, we care about survivors. But it should be, we want to listen to survivors and hear what they have to say. And then we tell them, okay, what do you want to do now? What would you like to do? What in your heart of hearts do you want? What will actually give you relief, justice, whatever? Like, what does justice feel like to you? And then how do these systems actually, how do we meet that? So that I think would be a value. I don't know if that's like empowerment. I don't know. I think all of these words are like buzzwords now, so I just don't like to use them. But really, that's what it is. You let people make the decision. Um, and I do think another value would actually be like meaningful sharing of resources. I know that I sort of at this organization we run like a ecosystem of support. We have a lot of other CSOs running hotlines. But I think increasingly these systems, the limitation is the reach. You can have all these sophisticated or rudimentary ecosystems of support, but it is still centralized. You, I don't think it's possible to deal with a problem like this with a centralized solution. Which means if there were infinite resources, there would be many micro ecosystems of support. And I think that is something we should strive towards, so that you can't just rely on this one hotline to actually meet the needs of a community that you are only hearing about or from. But community-based responses need to be given more support, more money, more funding, more capacity, and to incentivize people to actually support each other. Like I know that everybody's lives are tough, particularly in Sri Lanka, and that's also why there's very little political will around like solving or tackling gender-based violence, right? It's not, there's nothing to be gained from it and everything to be gained from not addressing. So how do we actually think about reversing that? And I hate to say it, but like money is a big incentive here. Um, so I think empowering should mean you fund and you support, monetarily support and sustain like smaller community-based responses. You have to do that. So I think those are like the values I can really think of. But if those fail, just like the power of everybody to just listen to me, and then we'll be fine.
I like that you came back to that. This is clearly like, we have a baby dictator somewhere.
Please don't. I actually don't. I hate being perceived, so this is all joke.
We'll edit this part out.
Yes.
But I think, okay, so what I'm hearing a lot from you is around autonomy, like, whether it's bodily autonomy around decision making, but also around how
Autonomy,
resources
yeah.
are moved. But I think I really like the idea of like decentralized solutions, because I think whether within technology or even more broadly to our governance issues also, it feels as if decentralized is really the solution. So yeah, I think the final question is there any like, final message or like, one thing that you want to leave with feminists who are doing, similar work, working around technology facilitated gender-based violence, or like particularly those who are just starting to work on it also, because like you said, there is a lot of interest in it. There is a lot more resources also going towards this issue now. It's a hot topic. So like, like from where you are, like based on your experiences, what would that message be?
Okay. Maybe I'll direct this to like newer feminists who are just joining this space, because there's a few things that I had no idea about that took me like some time and many disappointments later to figure out. So one is that it's not going to be easy because TFGBV is very complex. There's a lot of nuances depending on what region you're in, what country you're in, what you're looking at, what you're trying to research. There's a lot of complexity in it. But the beauty of it is that the internet is this like wonderful, beautiful place. And I think it's important for us to remember that the internet is only a modality for this violence, but not like the sole cause of this violence. And I think that's important to remember. It's also important to remember, I think, when you work on TFGBV, to not think of people, especially the people you research, as just victims or as just survivors. These people have very rich, vibrant lives in the digital space every day. And to reduce that to victimhood or survivorhood, I think, is such a disservice. It also takes a lot of humanity away from the people who endure or are subjected to this kind of violence. So I think that's important to remember, because the more you kind of only see them as survivors and victims, the less you actually think of them as people, as deserving of the form of justice that they feel is best for them. So that's one thing. And I think the other thing is, like I said, there's a lot of interest around it, which means there's also a lot of funding around it. And a lot of funding will unfortunately tell you what to do, what you should research. And I'm going to be straight up, stand your ground. You know your community best. You know what you want to do best. And it's okay to advocate for yourself. I know this is like, I hope I'm not too preachy about this, or like not like too toxic positive about this. But if one funding line falls through, there will be 10 others. I promise you, there's a lot of money that's getting pumped into looking at or tackling TFGP. And there are funders who are looking for more exciting things beyond just what are the numbers, what's the prevalence, all of that. There's a lot more exciting things to be done around TFGBV than just looking at what happens and how it happens. So when it comes to the work you want to do, I think it's important to always assess what does your community need, and then try to meet that need. And I am pretty sure, if you frame it in the right language, if you couch it in the right language, it is going to look attractive to funders. So be smart about it. Be very smart about it, and it's okay to stand your ground. You might not get a follow-up grant next year, but you can always take your work and apply for something else. Like that's completely fine. Because I think there's a lot of like research that goes into TFGB, for example, but everything speaks of the same thing, and then, like I said, you lose the sort of fundamental element of it, which is that you're dealing with people affected by a real issue. So if you're dealing with people affected by a real issue, then you should center the people in it, center the people in your. So I think those two things for sure.
Thank you so much, Saritha, and thanks for giving us your time. I learned a lot listening to you in this conversation, and hopefully other people, also have some takeaways from it. So thank you so much.